Ed Scott, the founding chair of the Center for Global Development. I'm very fond of saying, without whom none of us would be here. It's absolutely true. Ed.
Me included. um, I think it's a very good conversation, and it's obvious the issue of country ownership's clearly something that I think the Global Fund really put on a pretty good track by the creation of the institutions of the CCM, the country coordinating mechanisms, and insisting that civil society and various elements of a country's infrastructure be represented in deciding what the plan would look like that they would submit to the Global Fund for funding. So that's all been very, I think, constructive and has moved the ball a long way in this direction. And I think that Janice's point about Mark's insistence on PEPFAR beginning to look at that as well has been very constructive. But there's a 500-pound gorilla in the room that hasn't been ever mentioned, and that's misuse of funds. We just had multiple millions of dollars of contracts withdrawn from the Zambian government by the Global Fund and handed over to UNDP for implementation. That doesn't sound like country ownership to me. And the reason it's not country ownership is because in this particular case, the Global Fund determined that the country couldn't be trusted anymore. And so it gave but it didn't want the people who were getting the medicine to be hurt by this. So they gave the implementation responsibility over to UNDP. So, you know, we keep dancing around this. It's sort of like Minister Tedros said there's a certain lack of candor when people say, well, why aren't you for budget support? Well, that's a big reason why people aren't for budget support, because, you know, once the money gets into the Ministry of Health, you don't know if it's going to come out in what direction or not. Sometimes I won't say that. I don't mean to make a generalization for every country in Africa or in the developing world, because it's certainly not true. But the countries need to affirmatively make sure that issue is addressed. Otherwise, you're going to constantly have this sort of uneasiness and this game of, you know, we trust you, no, we don't trust you, sort of thing.
Ed, thanks very much. And of course, one possible solution to that is cash on delivery aid, because you make the payment after the thing has been achieved, and then, in theory at least, you don't care. You need the money? Well, but as you mentioned, Ed, there's a fair amount of money already out there. The question is creating incentives for the achievement of the goals. Let's see. I'll take the lady here in the pink sweater, and let's gather a few questions. This gentleman here can become next, and then the guy in front of him. Yes, please, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Peggy Clark with Global Health and Development at the Aspen Institute and the Ministerial Leadership Initiative. And I want to return to Minister Tedros' point about investing in architecture and ask for the other panelists' comments on this point. I think we're struggling for indicators of what it means to do country ownership, but I'd like to suggest that there are investments that can be made, particularly to Minister Tedros' point, in infrastructure to allow for states to become more able to manage things as our colleague Ed Scott has suggested, and specifically to say, and asked Minister Tedros to comment on, we invested in the business scorecard, which is a performance-based accountability system within Ethiopia that allows every member of the health system to sort of have a line of sight about what their indicators are and what their performance is. And no one would fund it at all. You know, all the donors that go to Ethiopia, because it's the darling, as we know. But we managed to carve out some funds from the Gates Foundation Ministerial Leadership Initiative to invest in Tedros in this. But he hasn't been able to get more funds for that. So I'd just like to raise the question of whether investing in architecture, information systems, performance accountability systems, particularly accountability, isn't a way forward in moving us from this murky theory to specific tangible investments and ways to track progress in country ownership. Thank you.
So when you said architecture, I thought initially you were talking about something else, but what I hear is data collection systems is part of what you're talking about, right?
Performance systems, accountability systems. Maybe Minister Tedros could put a point of clarification about the business scorecard, which is a perfect example. Capacity building architecture is what I'm talking about.
Okay, thanks. Gentleman here. There's a mic to your left.
Thank you. Eric Mead from the Institute for Alternative Futures. In the neighborhood where I live, if you took the adults out of every second home, you would have roughly the same demographics or age structure as Uganda and many other countries. So if we had an epidemic in my neighborhood, I might be leery of putting a lot of money behind community ownership or neighborhood ownership. So I guess following Mr. Scott's point, what is the issue there where half of the population of Uganda in the US would not even be old enough to drive?
Thanks. Just in front, yes.
Yes, George Greer with USAID, and this also builds on Mr. Scott's observation a bit. And I'm wondering what we have to be auditable, is my understanding of the monies that are spent overseas. And I think the previous woman's comments about how we can build systems and strengthen systems certainly rings true, but giving money directly and through swaps and through basket funding, to what degree are we flexible in being able to do that vis-a-vis Congress and accountability?
We've got a big panel and some difficult questions. I'm not going to ask necessarily to address any or all of them, but I think there are people who, if something spoke to you particularly. Dearest, are you indicating you'd like to say something in response to the questions and comments from the floor?
Yeah, I would like to talk about this question of auditable of the last question and also the capacity building architecture. Yes, the point here exactly is how can we guarantee, and also Ted addressed the situation in Zambia, and we also have a situation in Mozambique that it's not on the press, but also Global Fund for the last year and a half didn't do disbursements, just direct purchases for Mozambique, because actually there are problems of, I cannot say corruption, but of using the funds and explain how they were used. Global Fund requests, indicators, and certain procedures that the Ministry of Health was not able to fulfill until now. So I think that one important way of us to be able to have more transparency and information on how the funds are used, I would go back to the point of country and not just talking about national government. So what we feel, like my colleague Cesar said, is that there's no public information on allocation of funding in the beginning of the process, and there is not also on the use of the funding. And this has to do on one side because government and donors, they allocate together or they decide together how much would be put in the basket. This is the Mozambican process, but it's not publicly known. So in countries where the press is not very well seen and has no access to figures, it's very difficult to have some public control or watchdog. So I think this one step would be important. When the funds are allocated, it's publicly known. PEPFAR gave X and it's for the use in the following programs. Okay, so this is the first point, the public information on allocation, and secondly, on the use. This is another finding of our research. We have accounting systems that does not show the use of the funds by programs. We know that X was spent on salaries, but we were not able in this research to see how much was used in HIV, on tuberculosis or malaria, taking the case of the Global Fund. So this is the other point that we think it's very important, that the funds are used and we know publicly, and the donors and also the government. The third way is to increase this type of research we did. I'm not selling the product, but I think it's a way of having independent research, but it's very hard in the country. We fought so much to get data, in many cases we didn't get it. So this is the third practical suggestion I could do. And finally, not to talk too much, the point of building capacity. Also, it's not possible to build capacity without resources. And what we identified is that the money and the resources are at the national level. When it comes to the provincial and district levels, the money doesn't flow. So we would recommend donors to put provisions to guarantee that the money flows. And when we talk about information on allocation, we could say we have this big $15 million. X is from province A, B, C, and D, and it's openly known. So these are some ideas.
Yes, Freddie.
Thank you. Just want to add to this point because it's very important, and I think, as you all know, one of the key challenges we are having in terms of expanding and sustaining programs in our region is the misuse of funds and, of course, the reaction of donors by either withdrawing or basically not disbursing funds, or at least I want to credit, I think, Global Fund by trying to find alternatives. And also to create Global Fund for another reason. It's the only donor that actually allows for the country and communities in country to actually see where the problem is, who is stealing money. Other modalities tend to be covered up. You can't actually get to know what is coming to the country from the US government, for example. When we were doing this research, it was very hard. Even the government couldn't tell you how much is coming, even if they're in the driver's seat. The implementers can't tell you next year what the money will be. The beneficiaries don't know whether the benefits will continue to flow. So if you are a planner in that system, you basically have very little to work with. And so if funds come and nobody can really know what it is coming and for what purpose, it is very easy to misuse that funds. But when all the various levels do know what is happening, you actually build capacity both of civil society but also of government to really check on each other and ensure that corruption can be minimized. And I think if going back to the analogy of the running a driving lesson, if every time you make a mistake during the driving, the teacher takes over, you never learn. You basically need to have a relationship that allows for, of course, some punishment when there is, but of course, to get back to the purpose of achieving development, which requires that the capacity of these institutions are built and information, especially for accountability, is widely shared. Because I think there's a good example I want to share with you. World Bank actually required that government make public information about the budget from, especially around schools, because there was a lot of leakages. So when money is sent down from a government budget, schools are required to put on their notice board how much they've received. The districts also are required to do the same, all through the system. And money is actually also advertised in the papers that so much has gone to this implementer for this purpose. And as a helped to actually get that money to flow faster. And one would wonder why other development agencies, including the US government, cannot use such a best practice.
Buck? And I want to bring it back to this lady who talked about investment in these systems to build information, because that seems to be a recurring theme with a number of the people, both on the floor and on the panel. And if you're able to talk about the willingness or interest going forward to invest in these kinds of systems to track what's going on and make the information public.
Yeah, actually, I think there was a theme for me in all three of the questions or interjections from the floor. I was on a panel presentation on Friday at Global Health Council with Peter Piot, who pointed out that public health tends to be at least 10 years behind other sectors in applying new technology. And in the world of technology, that's like 3 generations of failing to apply the cutting edge. And I think we have systems that were developed in response to George's point that were probably developed 50 years ago that are very, very good at making sure that we can account for $250 in the hands of an NGO, but that are not as fleet of foot or adept at whether, noticing in advance whether or not $25,000 or $250,000 is about to go missing. So I think I'm speaking as myself, I'm not speaking on behalf of PEPFAR, but I think that there's definitely room for creative proposals for a new approach to accountability that focuses on support, not crime and punishment, that actually is about building systems. And the other thing that I would observe in response to Eric's point is every country that I've visited in Africa, young people are amazingly tech savvy. And so we ought to really be tapping the next generation of young Africans, young citizens of developing countries who perhaps have not yet bought into or been co-opted by the system, and who I think have the capacity to apply cutting-edge technologies to hold us accountable, but also to hold their own governments accountable.
Thanks very much. Janice, and then Caesar.
Okay. Just a short note to say that the Global Health Initiative really lays a platform for supporting innovation, risk-taking on some of these things. So I think the challenge we face is as this is rolling out is we see this, how do we articulate this and challenge our country teams who are working within country to be thinking about these things, and what are the ways that they could be really play a part in the learning lab as we go forward. I think we're all looking for, are there game changers out there that we haven't thought about? Where are they, and how can we figure it out and support them?
I said we'd do Caesar next. John,
Okay.
Don, if you have a remark, I'll come to you after that. Caesar.
Thanks, Lawrence. I think just remarking very quickly about the Zambian corruption scandal, I think for me that is a strong lesson about the inability or inadequacy of investing in infrastructure for financial management and for accountability and for information systems and so on. The scandal was very much a systems issue where a few rogue people actually saw the weaknesses in the system and took advantage of that. And it really demonstrates to me the importance of having now foresight of what happened, of probably strengthening those systems and improving them to ensure that those spillages actually don't happen. Getting the foresight. I mean, I already hear creative ideas about cash on delivery, about performance contracting and things like that. Maybe that's the way to go. And I think the idea is for everybody that says they're a partner to be committed and to be, as the Americans say, be ready to stick with the program.
Thanks very much. Don.
Just to say that architecture is about people as well as systems, and obviously we want the simplest systems possible for information technology, for surveillance, but ultimately we need trained people to manage those systems.
Thanks very much. Nandini, I offered you the last word. I think we're going to wrap up now, but perhaps you...
Just very quickly, I think this discussion clearly demonstrates, I think, the difficulty on both sides to come to some agreement. And I think this process that's been set in motion to clarify the objectives and really with honesty and recognizing the trade-offs of both sides. I think from the country perspective, what commitment really means, I think we no longer can really tolerate these words as sort of empty policy words, but really how that goes into practice. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to take that forward. And since I have the last word, I also want to thank my team at CGD for putting on this great show. I didn't have to worry about the logistics. I just worked with my colleagues who've made the trip all the way from Africa just for this event. And I wanted to thank Minister Tedros for really taking the time to prepare his comments, participate in this event. I know it's a lot of time out of his day. So we appreciate very much the opportunity to hear your remarks, and for all of our other chief guests, and of course the audience, because I think you take these messages out and it's a multiplier effect, hopefully wherever you work, to try and push the agenda, the learning agenda for difficult issues such as this. So thanks for coming. And of course,
Let's give our panel and